Hey everyone and welcome back to another Unreal multiplayer tutorial. In this video we'll be creating something like this. This is going to be the first part of the shared local multiplayer camera. We're going to create something like this by the end of this video and possibly the next one. I expect this to take 2 videos because we're going to make something a little bit more complex than I've seen in other content. We're going to have an average point in the middle of all of the characters that we want the camera to move towards, as well as getting the camera to zoom in and out to try and keep everyone within the frame. So this is going to be a kind of setup video. There are going to be a few things we need to account for regarding communication and some criteria before the follow camera starts actually following around, creating the camera and things like that. In the next video then we're actually going to create the logic inside of the camera. So I just wanted to set everyone's expectations in the correct place before we jump straight into the code. So for some of the setup, the first thing that I know that we need is that at the moment in the project we're working in, we can spawn all of the players in, but there's no kind of differentiation between when the input receivers are in use and when the players have been started to get spawned into the world. So what I'll do is I'm going to go to the project settings and I'm going to create a new input binding, and this is just going to be something that we can use when we've hit a certain number of players in the world, so the actual BP_player classes rather than the input receiver. When we have a certain number of these in the world, we're going to allow this button to be pressed under the input. We'll create a new one here, and this will be what activates the shared camera to actually start following everybody around. So what I'm going to do is I've made most of this for gamepad so far, so this will be another action mapping, just a single press. I'm going to call this one, we'll just say something like start game, and I'm going to set this to be keyboard Q for simplicity, as that's easy to press, and then for the gamepad I'll use the special left. So this is the select key or whatever they've called it on the recent iterations. Okay, so that's going to give us something to press in the player class. We're also going to want this camera class that we'll be using. So if we do that as the next step, we'll create our new follow camera type thing that we're going to have. So I'll come in here, and what we want this to be is going to be a very simple actor. It doesn't need to be possessed or anything. We'll create a new blueprint class of type actor. We'll name this one BP_camera. And then inside of this class, we can set this up with at least all of the parts that we'll need to act as the actual camera in the world. The logic for this I want to spend a little bit more time on, so that will be its own separate topic in the next video, but this is going to need a few things to begin. So first of all, we can get rid of the default scene routes. I'm going to replace this at the moment with a sphere. Now this will be optional and you'll see why as we go through, but this is just going to make it very, very easy to debug without the need to do things like spamming the event tick with a draw debug sphere to find where the average point is. But this is just going to be used for debug for now. We could even do something like we'll make this visible and then turn the visibility off as hidden in game when we don't need to debug anymore. The other thing we want to do is make sure this isn't blocking anything, so we'll make sure this doesn't have any collision. And this, from the example you saw earlier, this is the bit which is going to be in between all of the characters when we have them spawned in. Next, we will add a spring arm component to this. Pretty standard setup here, and then on the spring arm we'll add a camera. Okay, so what we can do with our new class is we can drag this into the world, find out roughly, I think this is going to be the forward facing, so we've got the forward, and bring this up somewhere in fact. So I think what we want to do is maybe put this in the middle of the map. So this is going to start roughly in the middle of the world, although I haven't put the floor in the middle, so I'm just going to drag that somewhere in the middle, because if we assume that all of the players are going to spawn in, then we're going to want to start roughly central to where all of the players are, so that when the camera does start following around it, there's not going to be a huge jump to its new position. We can then rotate this to look kind of where we're going to need this, and extend the spring arm so that we have the whole map in place. So that's pretty much how I've got the other one set up that I've shown you in the demonstration just a moment ago. If you wanted to make this more top down, that may make a bit more sense in this case, and we can play around with things like this, the rotation and things, a little bit later. So that's going to be a perfect place to leave the camera. This is kind of physically in the right location, and we will come back to the code a little bit later in this class. Okay, next, so we're going to handle now the BP_player stuff, the new logic that we need for the player class. This is that start game functionality. So I'm just going to remove some of the unused code here as well. I don't need the input, and I'm not going to be using this for touchscreen, that's fine. So we've called this start game. So we'll get the start game action event, and we want to call a function on our game mode. So in fact, what we want to do here as well is add a couple of extra functions to our BPI underscore game mode. So the first one is just going to be a function called start game. This only needs a single output just so that it appears in the graph as you've seen before. I'm going to call this one return, as remember that's just my naming convention so that I know this one won't be doing anything. And whilst we're here, I know that we're also going to need another function, which is going to be something for our input receiver to check, find out whether the game mode is currently in the playing state. So this is going to, you'll see why in a moment, to lock things off, like having extra widgets be spawned into place when the game's ready in motion. So we'll call this one get is in game, and this is going to return a boolean as well. This one is actually going to be a boolean that we'll use. So we'll name this one is in game. So this will highlight that this actually needs to return a value, and it isn't just there so that it appears in the function graph. So back into the player class, this is the only thing we need to do here. We're going to get the game mode. So we're still using this interface approach so that we don't have to worry about things like casting and doing direct class communication. We're just going to assume that the game mode has the interface on it, and we'll call this new function. So that's going to be the start game function, the message on the interface. We will run that one, and that is the player class pretty much done. That's everything that one needed to do. Now this will kind of work when we come over here, and we're going to go into the game mode at this stage to make our updates here, with a few caveats that we're going to come through and clean up a little bit later as we go through. So the first thing is we have our new start game and is in game. So the first thing we want to do inside of the start game function is we're going to create a few new variables and do a check here. So this is why I said we want to set some criteria to see what would class as kind of a valid point in which we can enter a game. So this is multiplayer, so the first thing that comes to mind is we want to check whether we have enough players to begin, which for testing sake I'm going to set to 2. So I'm going to do a branch check here, and I want to check that the number of players that have spawned into the world are more than or equal to 2. We're not currently tracking the players. I can see here we've got the start array and the controller array. So what we can do is as we spawn in our players, I'm just going to add this to an array as well. So we're pretty much tracking everything at this stage, so we can really very easily dip in and out of all of the variables that we may want to check. So I'm going to pull from here and say add. An easier way actually would to be searching for array, so that we narrow this down to the array functions, and then we can add this to an array. We'll plug this in. We can add a reroute node here to tidy things up a little bit, and of course we don't have this array at the moment, but this exposes everything, sets it to the right variables, so we can now promote this to a variable named players or active players, whatever you want this to be. Okay, so we now have this array. This is going to be populated every time that we spawn a new player into the world, and we can then come back into the start game. We can check the length of this, and as I said, we're going to see that, double check that this is more than or equal to 2 players. Now we of course don't like these magic numbers, so we're going to pull from here and we'll promote this to a variable as well, and we'll call this one minimum players. So we now know that this is relating to whether this is more than or equal to the minimum number of players before the game can start. If it is, then I'm just going to create a new function just to keep things a little bit tidier. So we're not doing things on the actual interface call, and I'll just name this one game started. So this will be the function which is going to be responsible for updating a lot of the different variables and tracking the actual things going on. So we'll just call this new function. We'll plug this in and then plug this into the return. Inside of game started, again, this is going to be very, very simple. We want a new variable, which I'm going to call b in game, or you could call this b is in game. So we're just going to query here whether or not we're in the game. We're going to set this to be true. So we have started the game, and this is going to be the variable that the input receiver is going to be looking for. Another thing we can do here is we can create a temporary function on the camera to just notify it that it has kind of started the game at this stage. So I'm going to create a function here. This again isn't going to have any logic in it, but we're just going to call this one game started, and we'll come back and fill this in the next video. But this allows us to get all of our game mode stuff out of the way. So the way that we're going to do this is on the begin play first of all. Before we do absolutely anything else, we're going to actually spend a little bit of time now, and we'll also get all of the camera actors in the level, which should only be this BP_camera, and we'll store a reference to that. So we're going to do that with the get all actors of class function. I'm going to pass in the BP_camera. So in fact, it's not all cameras, it's very specifically the BP underscore camera class that we've created that we're looking for. We're going to get the first index of the array, which we know is going to be the only one that we have, and we'll promote this to a variable. So nice and simple, we'll call this one camera ref, and we can now use that as we go through and change the different states of the game. So back into the game started once more, we're going to get our camera ref now. We're going to call that function that we've just made, which was game started. And I think there's going to be one thing which is going to be really useful for the camera to know here so that we don't need too much back and forward between the classes. We probably want to know the number of players which have been spawned in before this function was called. So if we grab the game started function, we'll add an input here. We'll get this one to be the type of BP underscore player. We're going to get this as an object reference, set this to be an array, and call this one active players. So this is going to be the 3, 4, 2, or however many players have been spawned in that the camera needs to follow. So that's going to be the only thing we'll need to do in this function, just so that we can pass that in now, because we've already created this array ready for use. So again, this just tidies up one other thing we don't need to worry about coming back here. Now, at this stage, this would kind of be working, but if you remember as well that in the player class, we still have the camera boom and follow camera that came by default on my project at least. So if you have something similar in yours, what we're also going to want to do is remove both of these. We don't want these to be automatically possessed or used by the game manager or any of the default properties. We want everything to be very kind of manually set for all of the different indexes for each of the characters to be set to this camera here. So if we press play, that's still not going to be the case, because what we can see over here, if you're not familiar, I just wanted to spend a bit of time going through this with you, is that we have 4 new camera actors spawned in. Basically, behind the scenes, whenever a player is created, which we're doing, we're implicitly calling somewhere in here the add player. It may be in the input receiver section. So when we're creating a player, we're creating a player controller, and all of this comes with things like camera managers, and each camera manager needs a camera, and all of that is being populated for us. So by default, index 1, which is input receiver 1, is going to be using this camera here, so it's automatically possessing or creating this camera that we can fly around with. Now, we don't really want that. What we're going to do instead is, and I'm showing you this because we will be coming in and adding some extra logic later to also remove those unused cameras so they're not there just kind of rendering away in the background. So what we're going to do instead is we want to come in, and as we're going through setting up the game mode stuff, where we're controlling things like the start points, the receivers, we're also going to control which camera we want to possess. So I think this will work quite well in the spawn input receivers, because this is kind of the most early stage in the process that we're getting these players created. So we want to make sure that even before the user starts pressing start to spawn in, we're looking through the right camera here. So to do this, this is really simple. We have our array here, so we are already tracking, in fact, everything we need. We want our current player controller, and we're going to use something called the set view target with blend. And we want the new view target to be the camera ref. This is basically just telling the player controller at the given index to do a blend. You can set a blend time so it actually kind of lerps and moves from one position to another over time. We're going to do this immediately so there's no kind of jolting or anything. And it's just telling it to use this new camera as the thing to look through. Now, this is obviously an actor class, not a camera class, but it will find the components in here and find the camera that it can look through. And we're doing this for all of the index. We actually only need to do this for player 1. In a shared screen multiplayer game, it's actually index 1 on the player controller where the camera is being controlled. But again, it's not going to hurt making sure that all of the different player controllers that are spawned in are also looking through the correct camera, just in case something a bit strange happens. We don't want that kind of random floating camera thing happen. So if we press play again now, that's solved that problem. Now this does cause a new issue, or it's not a new issue, this is just another issue. If we now spawn a player in, because we have recreated a player controller, we've set some new things up here, we are now kind of spawned into this guy's head, which isn't great. And we also have all of those extra cameras over here, again, still doing nothing. So in the game mode, a few more things that we can do here. Once we have possession of the camera that we want, and when we've done all of the logic for spawning things in and checking everything in the input receivers, I'm going to create a new function, which is called remove unused cameras. This is quite simply, we're going to use that get all actors of class again. This one, we will be looking for the most basic camera actor class. And for each of these that we find, we want to use a for each loop and then a destroy actor. And of course, making sure that we go back to our spawn input receiver and we make a call to our new function when all of the looping has been completed. And if we just go back and test this, nothing too fancy, but we can see here now on the side we only have our one camera. We have all of the camera managers, which we're still going to need. We can leave those as they are. And we haven't actually solved that other problem. That's still a thing that we're going to go and fix now. But at least we know that we only have kind of one camera in the level that we need to be concerned with. Now, unfortunately, there's no real clean way that I found to do this. So what we're going to do for the second issue of the camera being moved again, because there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that you'd need to override some of the C++ code, what we're going to do is we're just going to copy all of the set view target with blend, the camera reference, and when we spawn a player, as soon as we possess our player, so in the spawn player function, we're going to paste this in and we're going to just reactivate using this camera. So the only thing that we need to change here is we're not using the index anymore. That doesn't exist in this context. We're going to use the current player index. Again, you could just do this for player index 0. That would actually work at this stage. But just so that we know that all of the different player controllers are looking through the correct camera, it doesn't hurt to do this, and there's more chance that it could cause some irritation down the future by not doing it. So now if we press play, we'll come in, we'll spawn our player, we can move them around, and that is all working as expected, and we're looking through the correct camera. So these are just a few things I wanted to spend that little bit of extra time on in this video, rather than jumping straight into just getting the code working, just to let you know a few things that are going on behind the scenes, like all of the cameras being created, the possession of different cameras that you may or may not want, and how we can kind of overcome that. Now the final thing is that if we spawn in one player, and I'm pressing Q at the moment, that isn't going to start the camera doing anything. I just spawn in a second player, and I've now pressed Q or the left key, and in fact we can't see anything happening because we don't have any logic to kind of replicate this, and we're not even doing any debugging. So what we want to do is in the game mode, we're going to come in here. Once we've got past this start game call in the interface, and when we're actually in the start or game started function, we've passed that criteria. I'm just going to add a quick print string here, just so that we can see that something is happening. Because if you imagine at this stage then, so I've got one player, and we're pressing Q, so we're not entering the game, which is good. We now have our minimum number of players, and if I press the join game button, that has now launched the game. So you imagine that you're now kind of in the combat, you're playing, you're scoring points. What can still happen at this stage is if I'm connecting a new controller at the moment, I press start, and in fact that isn't working here because that weird play and editor thing. So if I play from this window, so I'm going to come in, I've got my two first players. We've started the game, so we've got hello appearing, so the game is in motion. I can then spawn in, so like I said, if you imagine you're currently playing the game, you're mid-combat, other people can come in and start bringing up their HUDs, bring in their own characters, which may not be something you generally want, unless you do have a really flexible drop-in, drop-out system. As we're not going to go that in depth, what I'm going to do instead is the final thing is the input receiver class. We're going to clean this up, and then we are ready to jump into the camera functionality in the next video. On the start pressed, we want to do another check just ahead of our isValid check here. So we're going to get our game mode. We're going to use that interface call that we've created, which was the isInGame. And we're going to use this Boolean here. We'll do a branch check, and we want to do a not check. I'm not a huge fan of driving things off of the false like this. I find it just a little bit easier to say if it isn't in game. So using the not Boolean. So if not in game, then we are allowed to spawn in another player. So that's just going to stop that small issue. So just a quick test for this. If we come in now, spawn the first two players. I'll start the game so we can see that said hello there. And then if I'm pressing start on the third controller, that shouldn't have happened. However, there's one more stage that we need to do. That is to go back into the game mode, go into the actual get isInGame interface call, and pass in the be isInGame boolean. So that's why we've been toggling that. Nice and simple step to overlook there. And then we're going to come back in, press play, we'll do that again. So we'll spawn in player 1, player 2, or 3. We have started the game, so hello is on the side. And I'm now pressing start with the other control pads, and we're not getting that widget come up. So we're now fully in game, no one can interrupt, no one can kind of drop in unwanted. And that is all pretty good and ready to go. One thing I just saw there is that we can have the spring arm colliding with things. So as we're kind of tidying things before getting the logic going, I'm just going to go to the spring arm in the camera class. We'll set the collision, do collision test on the spring arm to false, just so that if we do something like I did just there, where we spawn a player in, then we can walk over this and it's not going to jump around and get confused with the collision of things like the sphere versus the player. as that's not really something we need on this type of camera. Incredibly long topic there. This is why I didn't do the whole thing in one go. There's actually quite a lot going on when you're making a local multiplayer game. A lot of things you want to make sure you have full control of, which is kind of what we've set up here. So we've got some nice communication going. We have all of our checks and making sure that we can't get into any buggy, glitchy states at the moment. And that means that in the next video, we're going to be able to get this camera moving around really nicely, following, finding the averages, zooming in and out, and doing everything we want a good camera system to do. So I'll leave that video here for today. Some of these topics are getting a lot more complex, so hopefully you're enjoying the slightly longer videos. It's greatly appreciated if you leave a like and share the video around if you have found this useful, or if you think anybody else would as well, just to get this helping as many people as possible. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to get the updates on the following tutorials and anything else that is released on the channel. And of course, hit the notification bell so that those updates are actually delivered to you. As always, a huge thank you for all of the Patreon supporters. The new version of this project is now available on the Patreon page if you're supporting me over there. So I have the full camera system working. You can now download that ahead of time before the video series is complete. Just as an extra thank you for your continued support. And as ever, thanks for watching, and I will see you all next time.